My stepdad put a camera in my room to protect me. My stepfather, Jeff, installed a camera in my bedroom to protect me from our new neighbor. At least, that was the story he told my mom, the story he told me. But then he'd come into my room in the dead of night, the house silent except for the hum of the refrigerator, and sit on the edge of my bed to show me exactly what men like our neighbor supposedly do. His voice would be a low, almost excited whisper in the dark, and I learned very quickly what real danger felt like. When I finally worked up the courage to tell my mom, my voice trembling, she just rolled her eyes without looking up from the laundry she was folding. "Oh, honey," she'd sighed, "Jeff loves you like his own." Her words were a brick wall. I didn't say another word about it after that. Not to her, anyway. That was years ago. Yesterday, Jeff's world came to an end, and it felt like a lifetime of holding my breath was finally over. The man who saved me, in the end, was the same man Jeff taught me to fear. Thomas. It feels like Thomas came out of nowhere, but that's not right. He was always there, a quiet, looming presence in the periphery of my childhood. I was 9 when he moved into the house next to ours. The neighborhood gossip, which my mom absorbed like a sponge, was that he'd just lost his 2 young daughters in a tragic accident. He was a ghost of a man, haunted and solitary. To me, he just seemed sad, but my stepdad painted a much darker picture. "That man there," Jeff said to me one afternoon, pointing through our kitchen window as Thomas got his mail, "is a creep. But don't you worry, baby. I'll protect you." As he said it, he rubbed my back in slow, deliberate circles, and a cold dread that had nothing to do with Thomas washed over me. There was something in his tone, a kind of dark enthusiasm in his language, that made it feel like he was almost excited that Thomas, this supposed predator, was now living next door. It was like he'd been handed the perfect excuse, the perfect cover story for what he wanted to do all along. So, my stepdad sprinted into action, a valiant knight protecting his princess. He went to a big box store and came back with a state-of-the-art security camera. He installed it on the wall in my room, positioning it meticulously so it pointed directly at my bed, angled just so. "This way," he explained to my mom with a grave and serious expression, "we can make sure Thomas doesn't try to come inside through the window." My mom nodded, her face a mask of concern and gratitude. I just felt sick. He then started what he called his nightly safety checks. After he was sure my mom was sound asleep, her soft snores drifting from their bedroom, my door would creak open. He'd come in, a hulking shadow against the faint moonlight, and sit on my bed. He would explain, in nauseating and graphic detail, all of the things men like Thomas supposedly wanted to do. His descriptions were a poison that seeped into my 9-year-old mind, vivid and terrifying. He was painting a monster, but the whole time, the only monster in the room was him. The first time I tried to tell my mom about the weird, sick feeling Jeff gave me, the way his hand lingered too long on my shoulder or the way his eyes followed me, she was in the living room, wrestling with a mountain of clean laundry. I stood in the doorway, twisting the hem of my shirt. "Mom," I started, my voice barely a whisper. "Jeff keeps coming into my room at night." I saw her shoulders tense. "And oh honey," she cut me off, her voice tired and strained, not even bothering to look up from the t-shirt she was folding with sharp, precise movements. "Jeff loves you like his own daughter. You know that." The finality in her tone was crushing. But I had to try again. "But Mom, the camera, he put it up, but it's pointing right at my bed, not the window." She finally stopped, a pair of Jeff's socks in her hand, and looked at me. But the expression on her face wasn't the concern I was desperately hoping for. It was annoyance.
Pure, un dilute di irritation.
"Stop being so dramatic," she snapped. "Jeff knows what he's doing. He manages all the security for his business, for goodness sake. He's just protecting you from that creep next door. I see the way he looks at you." She then gave me a quick, awkward half hug, the kind you give when you want a conversation to be over, and told me to go do my homework. But her words snagged in my mind. Something was deeply wrong with what she'd said. Thomas never looked at me. He never looked at any of the kids in the neighborhood. In fact, he did the opposite. When the school bus rumbled to a stop at our corner in the afternoon, if he was outside, he'd turn and go back into his house. When families with young children walked by on the sidewalk, he would find a sudden, urgent reason to turn away and inspect his rose bushes. But there was something else he did, something I only started to piece together later. Whenever Jeff would take me out alone for ice cream or to the park, Thomas would suddenly need to walk his little scruffy dog. He'd stay on the other side of the street, a silent, watchful guardian I didn't yet understand. When Jeff decided to set up the kiddie pool in the backyard and bought me this tiny, 2-piece bikini that made my skin crawl with discomfort, Thomas picked that exact moment to meticulously wash his car in his driveway, his presence a clear, unspoken deterrent. Jeff's behavior got worse after that, as if Thomas's silent vigilance was a challenge. The tickle fights he initiated would last far too long, his fingers digging into my ribs until I was gasping, the laughter long gone and replaced by a frantic panic. He started insisting on giving me my baths, using the excuse that my mom was working late and I needed to be supervised. Everything finally exploded on a hot, sticky Saturday afternoon. Mom was at work, and Jeff had been drinking beer since noon, the empty bottles lining the kitchen counter. He cornered me in the garage while I was looking for my bike helmet. "You're becoming such a pretty girl," he slurred, his words thick and sticky. He put his heavy hands on my shoulders and pushed me back against the cold, peeling paint of the garage wall. "Let me show you something special." I was frozen. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't scream. My throat closed up tight. All those lessons from school, all those talks from Jeff about stranger danger and how Thomas was the one I needed to fear, spun chaotically in my head. But it wasn't a stranger's hands on me. It was Jeff's. His breath was a foul wave of stale beer, and his fingers were squeezing my shoulders so tight I knew there would be marks. "Sorry to bother you." The voice cut through the thick, terrifying air. Thomas stood in the open garage doorway, a silhouette against the bright afternoon sun. My cat got out. "Little orange tabby. Mind if I check in here?" Jeff's whole face changed in an instant, a mask of friendly concern snapping into place. His hands dropped from my shoulders as he turned, putting on his best friendly neighbor smile. "No cat in here, Thomas," he said, his voice smooth as butter. "You should probably leave." But Thomas didn't move. He took a deliberate step inside, his eyes scanning the cluttered space. "I'm pretty sure I saw him run this way," he said, his voice calm and even. "Let me just check behind those old boxes real quick." Jeff's smile tightened. "I said leave." His voice was sharp now, a blade hidden in the velvet. "Just need to find my cat," Thomas repeated, his tone unwavering. He didn't move an inch. They were locked in a silent battle of wills, two stags with their horns locked. In that moment of standoff, I saw my chance. I slipped past Jeff's side and ran, my bare feet slapping against the hot driveway as I scrambled back into the perceived safety of the house. That night, my mom and Jeff sat me down on the living room couch for a talk. It wasn't a talk, it was an ambush. They told me that Thomas was a dangerous man, a manipulator who was trying to destroy our happy family. They said I should never, ever go near him again, and that I needed to always trust my stepdad because he only wanted what was best for me. I sat there, nodding numbly, not believing a single word of it. All I could think about, the only image that filled my head, was the way Thomas had stood in that doorway, a calm, solid presence that had saved me. So the next day, I did something I wasn't supposed to do. I saw Thomas walking his dog down the street, and I ran outside. The words just spilled out of me in a frantic, jumbled rush. "Jeff does things. He touches me," and I couldn't finish. I didn't have to. Thomas stopped walking and looked down at me, his expression unreadable but quiet. "I know," he said, his voice so soft I barely heard it. "I've been documenting everything." He then did something I never expected. He took me to the police station. He walked me right up to the front desk to report what Jeff had been doing. But the moment we walked in, I knew it was a mistake. The air in the station was stale and unwelcoming. Instead of listening to a terrified child telling them that her stepdad was hurting her, the two officers behind the high counter just laughed. They looked from me to Thomas, a smirk playing on one of their faces. "Jeff Morrison," the officer said, leaning back in his chair. "He coaches my kid's softball team. Runs that charity thrift store downtown. He'd never do something like that." Then he fixed his gaze on Thomas, his eyes hardening. "You, on the other hand, it seems a little fitting, given your past, why you'd be here with this little girl." I tried to speak up, to defend Thomas and tell my own story, but a woman officer appeared and led me away into a small, windowless room. She didn't ask me a single question about Jeff. Her questions were all about Thomas. What did he say to me? Did he ever touch me? Did he promise me things to get me to come here? No matter how many times I tried to explain, to steer the conversation back to Jeff, she just guided it right back to Thomas. It was like talking to a wall. They sent us both out of the station less than an hour later, but not before threatening to arrest Thomas for filing a false report if he ever bothered them again. The police must have called Jeff the second we walked out the door because when I got home, my stomach in knots. Both he and my mom were waiting for me in the living room. Mom's face was a blotchy, furious red. She grabbed my shoulders and shook me, her fingers digging in just like Jeff's had. "Do you have any idea what people will say? Jeff's reputation, his business, everything could be ruined because of you and your lies." Over her shoulder, I saw him. Jeff was just standing there, watching us, a slow, triumphant smile spreading across his face as he rested his hand on his trousers. That night, he came into my room. I won't describe what happened, but when he finally left, closing the door softly behind him, I couldn't move. I just lay there, staring at the blinking red light of the camera, for an hour, maybe two. I was too traumatized to speak, to cry, to do anything. Then, when the house was finally silent and I could hear their snores from down the hall, I did something I had never done before. I slid out of bed, my limbs feeling heavy and disconnected from my body. I opened my window as quietly as humanly possible and climbed out into the cool night air. I had to get help. I limped across the dark, damp grass of our yard to Thomas's house and knocked softly on his back door. When he opened it, his face etched with worry, I saw them. And I froze completely. On the couch in his living room, huddled under a blanket, were his two daughters. The same girls from the smiling photos I'd seen on his mantle. Same dark, wavy hair, same deep brown eyes. But these weren't the happy children from the pictures. Their faces were pale and drawn. The older girl had a constellation of purple marks on her arm, and I could see the faint yellowing of old bruises on their legs. Thomas quickly stepped outside, closing the door partway behind me, and knelt down to my level. His hands stayed at his sides, a careful, deliberate gesture of not touching me. The soft lamp in the living room cast long, dancing shadows across his worried face as he glanced between me and the girls on the couch. The older one, who looked maybe 7 or 8, pulled the blanket up higher over herself and her little sister. They just watched me with wide, silent eyes. The younger one was sucking her thumb, leaning heavily into her sister's shoulder for comfort. Thomas stood up and disappeared into his kitchen, returning a moment later with a glass of water. He set it on the coffee table in front of me, then sat in an armchair across the room, giving me space, not crowding me the way Jeff always did. My legs were shaking uncontrollably as my brain tried to process what I was seeing. Everyone said Thomas lost his daughters. My mom had told me they died in a car accident. Jeff had insinuated, with a dark and knowing look, that Thomas had probably done something to them himself. But here they were,
Alive.
hiding in his house. The older girl whispered something to her sister, then her eyes met mine. She pointed to the bruises on her own arm, and then pointed a small finger upward, toward what I guessed was a bedroom upstairs. Her eyes filled with tears, a silent story passing between us. Thomas rubbed his face with both hands, a gesture of pure exhaustion, like he hadn't slept in a week. When he finally spoke, his voice was cracked and raw. He explained everything. His ex-wife had full custody. She had a new boyfriend, a man who hurt the girls. He told me that every single time he tried to report the abuse, the courts and the police dismissed him as just a bitter ex-husband trying to cause trouble. He pointed to a thick, bulging folder on the coffee table. It was filled with papers, court documents, medical reports, photographs of bruises, everything dated and meticulously organized. Just like he'd been documenting Jeff. The younger girl started crying softly, a muffled sound against her sister's shoulder. Her sister hugged her tighter, whispering that it was okay, that Daddy would keep them safe now. Thomas got up and went to the kitchen to make them hot chocolate, his movements gentle and practiced. I just sat there, still in my pajamas, the phantom pains from what Jeff had done still echoing through my body, watching this man everyone in the neighborhood called dangerous as he so carefully took care of his injured, terrified daughters. He never touched them unnecessarily. He asked for permission before he gently checked a new bruise on the older girl's arm. He let them choose where to sit, what to drink, when they wanted to talk. He gave them a power and a respect that Jeff had never, ever given me. He explained that he'd taken them 3 days ago, a desperate act of a desperate father. He'd found out the boyfriend had broken the younger one's rib. The hospital wouldn't admit her or even properly examine her without the mother's permission. The police said that without proof of immediate danger, they couldn't intervene. So he did what he had to do. Now they were hiding here. He'd been homeschooling them, only letting them play in the backyard after the sun went down and the neighbors had all gone inside. That's why no one ever saw them. That's why everyone thought they were gone. The older girl finally spoke, her voice so small it was almost a breath. She asked me, "Are you hurt too?" I could only nod, a lump forming in my throat that made words impossible. She scooted over on the couch, patting the empty space between her and her sister. It was an invitation. I sat down between them, and they immediately covered me with their shared blanket. It smelled like laundry detergent and something I could only describe as safety. The younger one, without a word, offered me her worn, stuffed rabbit to hold. I took it, clutching its soft body to my chest like a lifeline. Thomas stayed in his chair across the room, just watching us. He asked if I needed to see a doctor. I shook my head quickly, a fresh wave of panic rising. Doctors meant questions. Questions meant police. And the police meant they'd just send me right back home to Jeff. He seemed to understand without me having to explain anything. Instead, he got out a first aid kit and set it on the table, just in case. He showed me where the bathroom was if I needed to clean up and found an extra blanket and a pillow for me on the couch. Eventually, the girls fell asleep, their small bodies leaning against me, their breathing evening out into a soft, rhythmic sound. Thomas turned the TV on to a cartoon channel, keeping the volume so low it was just background noise. He stayed awake in his chair, a silent sentinel keeping watch over the three of us. I thought about my mom, at home in her bed, probably still sound asleep, completely oblivious. I thought about Jeff, lying next to her, satisfied and content with what he'd done. I thought about how tomorrow morning, they would both act like nothing had happened. Mom would make pancakes, Jeff would read his newspaper at the kitchen table, and I would have to sit there and pretend along with them. Thomas must have seen the despair on my face, because he spoke again, his voice quiet and careful. He said I could stay as long as I needed to, that he'd been trying to build a case against Jeff for months, ever since he first saw the way Jeff looked at me. He told me he knew people who could help, real people, not the cops who had laughed in our faces. He showed me more of his documentation, his secret files on Jeff. Every time Jeff took me somewhere alone. Every time he bought me inappropriate clothes. Every time Thomas just happened to be outside when something felt wrong. It was all there, pages and pages of dates, times, and cold, hard observations. He had been protecting me the only way he could, from a distance, building an arsenal of truth. The sun started to come up, painting the living room in pale, hopeful shades of yellow and pink. The girls stirred in their sleep, but didn't wake. Thomas made coffee for himself and toast for me, setting a plate on the table near the couch. He ate standing up in the kitchen, still giving us our space. I knew I couldn't stay. I knew I would have to go home eventually. Mom would wake up and panic when she found my bed empty. She would call the police. And they would search everywhere, and the very first place they would look would be Thomas's house. But for those few hours, sitting on that couch between two little girls who understood my pain without me having to say a word, who didn't judge me or blame me or tell me I was being dramatic, who just shared their blanket and their stuffed animal and their quiet, comforting companionship, I felt safer than I had in years. Just then, Thomas's phone buzzed on the end table. He picked it up and I saw all the color drain from his face. He wordlessly showed me the screen. It was a text from an unknown number, but I recognized the phrasing, the cadence, the specific brand of cruel threat. They were Jeff's words. He was threatening Thomas, saying he knew where I was, saying that Thomas had better send me home right now, or things were going to get very, very ugly. My hands started shaking again, the fragile sense of safety shattering like glass. The younger girl woke up from the movement and saw the terror on my face. Without a word, she climbed into my lap and wrapped her tiny arms around my neck. Her sister woke up too, instantly alert, her eyes wide with a familiar, shared fear. Thomas quickly deleted the text and turned off his phone. He went to the front window and peeked through a tiny gap in the blinds. Jeff's truck was parked across the street, the engine running, just waiting. We all knew what it meant. I couldn't stay. If Jeff came to the door, if he caused a scene, the police would come back. And this time, they would search the house. They'd find Thomas's daughters. They would take them away and send them back to their mother and her violent boyfriend, back to the world of bruises and broken ribs. I couldn't let that happen. Not after what they had done for me. Thomas knelt in front of me again, maintaining that same careful, respectful distance. He promised me he wouldn't stop fighting for me. He would keep documenting, keep building the case. He swore that someday, somehow, they would make people listen. The older girl grabbed my hand. She squeezed it 3 times, a tight, rhythmic pulse. A secret message. I squeezed back. I stood up, my legs feeling like jelly. Thomas walked me to the back door, the same one I'd come through just hours before. He handed me a small, folded piece of paper. On it was a phone number and a woman's name, Sarah. He said she was someone who could help when I was ready, someone who wouldn't dismiss me. I folded it carefully and tucked it deep into the pocket of my pajama pants. The walk back across the yard felt like miles. Each step was taking me further away from the only safety I'd known and closer to my living nightmare. But as I walked, I thought about those 2 little girls hiding in Thomas's house. I thought about their bruises and their incredible bravery. I thought about their father, Thomas, who was risking absolutely everything to protect them. I could be brave, too. When I climbed back through my bedroom window, the first thing I saw was Jeff. He was standing by my bed, his arms crossed over his chest, his face twisted into a mask of pure rage. But I didn't cry. I didn't beg for forgiveness. I just stared back at him with the same steady, defiant gaze that Thomas had taught me. He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into the flesh, a familiar pain. He hissed a torrent of threats about what would happen if I ever went to Thomas's house again, about how he'd make sure Thomas went to prison for the rest of his life, about how no one, absolutely no one, would ever believe a single word I said. I let him rant. I let him squeeze my arm until I knew it would leave a dark, ugly bruise. Because now I knew the truth. Thomas wasn't the predator. He was the protector. And he was building a case, a fortress of facts that would one day destroy Jeff. All I had to do was survive until then. Just then, my mom appeared in the doorway, her hair a messy halo from sleep. She saw Jeff gripping my arm, saw the tears welling in my eyes, and instead of asking what was wrong, instead of rushing to my side, she just sighed. A deep, weary sigh, as if I was the problem, as if I was the one who was always causing trouble. They left me alone in my room, finally, with a final warning to get ready for school, to act normal, and to remember that Jeff loved me and was only trying to keep me safe. I sat on the edge of my bed, feeling the dull throb in my arm and the deeper ache in my soul. The camera he'd installed, my silent tormentor, blinked its little red light at me. Recording. Always recording. But now I knew that Thomas was recording too. And his evidence, his truth, would matter so much more. At school that day, I was a ghost. I could barely focus on the teacher's lessons, the words blurring into a meaningless drone. Every loud noise in the hallway made me jump out of my skin. Every man who walked past the classroom door, even the friendly janitor, made my heart hammer against my ribs. During lunch, I found a quiet, dusty corner in the back of the library and unfolded the small piece of paper Thomas had given me. The woman's name was Sarah. Underneath it, he'd written social worker, with a note that she specialized in cases like mine. She was someone who actually listened to children, someone who knew how to navigate the twisted, broken system when the system itself had failed. I sat there, staring at the number, memorizing the digits until they were burned into my brain. Then, I carefully tore the paper into the tiniest possible pieces and flushed them down the school toilet. There could be no evidence for Jeff to find. The rest of that school day crawled by in a thick fog of anxiety. Every time a teacher called my name, I flinched, convinced I was in trouble. During art class, my hands were shaking so badly that I knocked over a jar of dirty paint water, the murky liquid spreading across the table. The sudden mess, the sudden attention, it was all too much. I burst into tears, and the teacher, a kind woman with worried eyes, sent me to the nurse's office. The nurse took my temperature and asked gentle, probing questions about whether everything was okay at home. I just nodded and forced a smile. Jeff's hissed warnings about what would happen if I told anyone echoing in my ears. On the bus ride home, I pressed my face against the cool glass of the window and watched Thomas's house pass by. The curtains were all drawn tight. There was no sign of movement, no sign of life. I wondered if the girls were inside doing their homeschool lessons, if they felt safe with their father, if they truly understood why they had to hide from the world. Jeff's truck wasn't in our driveway when I got home, which was a small, temporary relief. But my mom was in the kitchen, and her movements were sharp and aggressive as she prepared dinner. She slammed cabinet doors and banged pots and pans on the stove with unnecessary force. When she saw me walk in, her expression hardened into a familiar mask of disapproval. She informed me, her voice clipped and cold, that Jeff had to leave work early because of my behavior. His boss had apparently questioned why he needed to monitor our neighbors so closely, why he was so distracted. She said people at his charity were starting to ask uncomfortable questions, all because I couldn't keep my mouth shut and stay away from that monster, Thomas. I didn't argue. I just went to my room. The camera's little red light blinked at me, a constant, unblinking eye. I wondered if Jeff watched the footage every single day. If he fast-forwarded through the boring parts, the hours I spent doing homework or reading. If he saved certain clips. The thought made my skin crawl. That evening, Jeff came home with a bouquet of flowers for my mom and a brand new doll for me. The doll had long, blonde, plastic hair and a frilly pink dress. He placed it on my bed and ruffled my hair, acting as if the rage-filled confrontation that morning had never happened. My mom smiled and kissed his cheek, praising him for being such a thoughtful husband and a wonderful father. The hypocrisy of it all was suffocating. During dinner, they started talking about Thomas again. My mom mentioned, in a casual, gossipy tone, that she'd seen a moving truck at his house earlier in the day. Jeff's fork paused halfway to his mouth. He asked her if she was sure, and she nodded. She'd seen men carrying boxes inside, though she couldn't tell what they contained. A muscle in Jeff's jaw tightened. After dinner, he went outside to smoke on the porch, something he only did when he was deeply stressed. Through the living room window, I watched him stare at Thomas's house, the cigarette glowing like a malevolent orange eye in the encroaching darkness. That night, Jeff's safety check lasted longer than usual. He sat on my bed, the new doll lying between us, and explained in a low voice that Thomas was probably planning something terrible, that the boxes might contain weapons or tools for hurting children. He told me I needed to tell him immediately if I saw anything at all, that seemed suspicious. I lay perfectly still, clutching the cold plastic doll, and agreed to everything he said. When he finally left, I waited, counting the seconds until I heard the low rumble of his snores from their bedroom. Then I crept to my window and peered through the curtains. A shadow moved past one of the windows in Thomas's house. Then another, much smaller shadow. The girls were awake, too. The next morning, my mom drove me to school instead of letting me take the bus. She said Jeff thought it was safer this way, at least until they figured out what Thomas was up to. This became our new routine for the next week. Drive to school, drive home, stay inside. No playing in the yard, no riding my bike with the other kids, no freedom. Jeff installed more cameras around our property, big, obvious ones, all aimed directly at Thomas's house. During this time, I became a spy in my own home. I noticed things. Thomas's car left every single morning at exactly 7:45 a.m. and returned at 5:30 p.m., like he had a normal 9-to-5 job. On Tuesday, a grocery delivery truck stopped at his house. On Thursday, I saw him carrying in a large box filled with what looked like school supplies and art materials. Jeff noticed, too. He started keeping a little black notebook, meticulously writing down every movement, every delivery, every time Thomas stepped outside to get the mail. He'd show the notebook to my mom in the evenings, pointing to his entries as if they were irrefutable evidence of suspicious, criminal behavior. And my mom, wrapped up in his paranoia, would nod and agree that it was very concerning that Thomas was receiving so many deliveries. One afternoon, while Mom was at the grocery store and Jeff was tinkering with something in the garage, I heard a soft, hesitant knock at our back door. My heart hammered against my ribs as I peeked through the curtain. It was the older girl from Thomas's house. She stood on our stoop, glancing around nervously, her small frame tense with fear. I opened the door just a crack. Without a word, she thrust a folded piece of paper into my hand and then turned and ran back across the yard before I could even speak. I quickly shut and locked the door, my hands trembling, and ran to the bathroom, the only room in the house without a camera. I unfolded the note. The message was written in a child's careful, looping cursive. Dad says you're brave. We're leaving soon. Stay strong. I tore the note into tiny, confetti-like pieces and flushed it down the toilet, just like I had with Sarah's number. But the words were seared into my mind. They were leaving. Thomas was taking his girls somewhere safe, and I was going to be left behind. Alone. With Jeff. That evening, Jeff discovered that one of his new outdoor cameras had been repositioned. Someone had tilted it just enough, so it was pointing at the sky instead of at Thomas's house. He interrogated me for an hour, his voice getting louder and louder, demanding to know if I had touched it. I denied everything, but he didn't believe me. As punishment, he took a screwdriver and removed the lock from my bedroom door. For your safety, he explained to my mom later, so I can check on her more easily if Thomas tries anything. My mom, now fully under his spell, supported the decision completely. 3 days later, everything accelerated. I woke up to the sound of shouting outside. I ran to my window and saw 2 police cars parked in Thomas's driveway. Officers were talking to him on his front porch. Thomas stood there calmly, his hands held up in a peaceful, non-threatening gesture. And in our yard, watching the whole scene with an air of smug satisfaction, was Jeff. He had finally done it. He'd called in some kind of complaint that had brought the police racing to the scene. But Thomas remained calm. He showed the officers some papers, gesturing toward his house. After several long, tense minutes, the police officers just left. They didn't arrest him. They didn't even go inside. Jeff's face darkened with a familiar, terrifying fury. That afternoon, while Jeff was at work and my mom was on the phone, I saw movement in Thomas's backyard. He was loading boxes into the trunk of his car, moving with a quick, careful efficiency. The girls were nowhere in sight, but I just knew, they were already in the car, hidden under a blanket in the back seat. He was really leaving. He was taking his daughters somewhere safe, and he was abandoning me. A desperate, primal urge to run outside, to scream, to beg him to take me with them, washed over me. But I knew I couldn't. It would ruin everything. Jeff would have the police stop Thomas, they would find his daughters, and they would send them back. So I just stood there, a silent prisoner behind my own window, and watched as Thomas closed his trunk and walked around to the driver's side door. He paused for a moment and looked directly at my window. Our eyes met across the distance. He pressed his hand to his heart and then pointed at me. A silent message. I'll remember you. Stay strong. Then he got in his car and drove away. The empty house next door felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. My protector, my silent guardian, was gone. Without Thomas's watchful presence, Jeff grew bolder. The nightly safety checks became longer, the boundaries he crossed more significant. He started insisting on supervising my baths again, using the excuse that my mom was working late and he was just making sure I was safe. I felt like a trapped animal, the walls of my cage closing in day by day. 2 weeks after Thomas left, I made a decision. I couldn't risk calling Sarah's number from my home phone, but I remembered her name. During my weekly library time at school, I used one of the public computers to search for social workers named Sarah who specialized in child advocacy cases in our state. I found 3 possibilities. I memorized their office addresses, a desperate, half-formed plan beginning to take shape in my mind. But how would I get to any of them? My mom drove me everywhere now. I had no freedom, no money, no way to escape. The opportunity came unexpectedly. My mom got a bad case of food poisoning and spent an entire day violently ill. Jeff, annoyed and put out, had to take me to school. He was complaining about missing an important meeting at work, driving faster than usual, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. At a long red light, I saw my chance. We were stopped right outside a small strip mall, and I saw a sign for a counseling center. One of the Sarahs I had researched worked just 3 blocks away from that very spot. My hand, acting of its own accord, moved to the door handle. Jeff noticed immediately. He grabbed my wrist, his grip like iron. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. I quickly made up a story about feeling carsick, about needing fresh air. He studied my face for a long, tense moment, but eventually released my hand. The moment passed. The light turned green. We continued on to school, but now he knew. He knew I was planning something. That afternoon, my mom picked me up, but she seemed different. She was nervous, constantly checking the rearview mirror, taking strange, roundabout routes home. When we pulled into the driveway, Jeff was waiting, and he wasn't alone. There was a man with him I didn't recognize. The man introduced himself as a family counselor. Jeff, with a concerned and loving smile, had hired him to help me with my behavioral issues and my unhealthy fixation on our former neighbor. The session felt like an interrogation. The counselor asked gentle, leading questions about Thomas, about why I had gone to his house, about what he had told me. I gave vague, careful answers, but I knew this was just another trap closing around me. That night, Jeff installed a new, heavy-duty lock on my window. The house was becoming a prison. I started planning more desperately. I hid a butter knife from the dinner table, thinking I could use it to pry open the window lock. I saved the quarters I was given for lunch money, slowly building a tiny escape fund. But Jeff seemed to anticipate my every move. He found the butter knife during one of his random room searches. He started checking my backpack for money. He even put a string of little bells on my bedroom door that would jingle if I tried to open it at night. And my mom supported every single new restriction. She had become completely convinced that I had serious problems, that Thomas had somehow brainwashed me. She started talking about sending me away to a special boarding school for troubled children. 1 month after Thomas left, I reached my breaking point. Jeff's touches during the nightly checks had become more frequent, more invasive. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I was a bundle of raw, exposed nerves. That afternoon, something unexpected happened. A new family was moving into Thomas's old house. I watched from my window as they unloaded their furniture. They had a teenage daughter who looked to be a few years older than me. She looked confident and strong. An idea, a tiny, fragile spark of hope, began to form. If I could somehow communicate with her, maybe she could help. She was old enough to drive, old enough to be believed. But how could I possibly reach her with Jeff watching my every move? The answer came during a particularly bad night. Jeff's safety check had gone too far, leaving me shaking with a silent, helpless rage. As he'd gotten up to leave, satisfied with his power over me, he hadn't noticed that in the struggle, I had managed to slip his phone from the pocket of his pants. I had minutes, maybe seconds, before he realized it was missing. Huddled under my blanket, my fingers flying across the screen, I frantically searched social media for the teenage neighbor's name, which I'd overheard her parents call out. I found her profile and sent a desperate, anonymous message.
Please help.
Man in the house next door, hurting me. Can't tell anyone. He coaches softball, runs a charity. No one believes me. I deleted the message from Jeff's sent folder and cleared the browser history. Then I slipped the phone under my pillow just as my door burst open. Jeff was demanding to know where his phone was. I pretended to be asleep, and he found it after a frantic search of my bed. He was suspicious, but he couldn't prove anything. The next day, he changed his phone password and started locking it in his truck when he was home. I watched the neighbor's house obsessively, looking for any sign that she had gotten my message. Days passed with nothing. Hope began to curdle into despair. Maybe she'd ignored it, thought it was a prank. Jeff noticed my fixation on the new neighbors and warned me not to bother them, not to spread my lies around the neighborhood. He installed another camera, this one aimed directly at their house, claiming it was for general security. The walls were closing in. I was drowning. Then one evening, as I stood at my window staring at the house next door, the teenage girl, Vicky, was on her porch reading. She looked up suddenly, her eyes finding mine through the glass. She held up her phone and pointed at it, then pointed at me. A question. I nodded frantically, my heart leaping into my throat. She typed something, then held up a piece of paper with large, block letters written on it. Tomorrow. Library. 3 p.m. I nodded again, tears of relief blurring my vision. She gave me a quick thumbs up before disappearing back inside. The next morning, I forced myself to throw up at breakfast. My mom, alarmed, felt my forehead and declared I had a fever. She called the school, then called Jeff. After a long debate, they decided I was old enough to stay home alone for a few hours. At 2:45 p.m., I used a bobby pin I'd hidden to work on the cheap lock Jeff had installed on my window. I climbed out and ran. I arrived at the library, breathless and terrified, and found Vicky waiting in the young adult section. I spilled everything. About Jeff, the cameras, Thomas, the police, my mom, the counselor. Her face grew paler with each detail. She told me she had researched Jeff after getting my message and found old, cryptic social media posts from women in his past, hints of allegations that had never gone anywhere. She promised to help, but she warned me we'd need real, undeniable evidence. We created a plan. She would try to find Sarah, the social worker. She would watch for opportunities to gather evidence. We agreed on a set of secret signals. If I needed immediate help, I'd put my stuffed bear in the window. If she had information for me, she'd leave her porch light on during the day. Small things Jeff wouldn't notice. I wasn't alone anymore. The next few weeks were a careful, terrifying dance. I endured Jeff's nightly visits, but now I was documenting everything in a composition notebook hidden inside my pillowcase. Vicky made progress. She found Sarah's office and confirmed she was the right person, but we needed more than just my word. The breakthrough came from the counselor. In his eagerness to build a case against me, he had requested all of my old medical records, including a visit to the emergency room from 6 months prior for unexplained bruising. Jeff had claimed I'd fallen off my bike, but the doctor, it turned out, had been suspicious. He had noted in the file that the bruise patterns were unusual for a fall, that they resembled grip marks. Vicky's older cousin was a nurse at that same hospital. She managed to get a photo of the doctor's original, detailed notes. We had it. Something undeniable. Sarah, the social worker, acted fast. She contacted the ER doctor, who agreed to provide a formal statement. Meanwhile, Jeff's behavior at home was spiraling. He had scheduled a psychiatric evaluation for me, seeing it as the final step in having me declared delusional and sent away. One night, he made a critical mistake. He'd been drinking and forgot to check that his bedroom camera was working. It had malfunctioned earlier that day. But Vicky's phone, positioned at her window with a night vision app, recorded everything through my open curtains. The next morning, I could barely walk. The school nurse, a mandatory reporter, documented my injuries, my vague, terrified answers, and quietly contacted Sarah's office. Within an hour, Sarah arrived at the school, accompanied by a police detective who specialized in crimes against children. Not the same cops who had laughed at me. This was different. I showed them my hidden notebook. Vicky provided the video. By lunchtime, officers were at Jeff's workplace. They arrested him in front of his boss and all his charity volunteers. My mom received a call and came racing to the school, screaming about how I was destroying our family. Sarah intercepted her in the parking lot. But it wasn't until investigators showed her the video from Vicky's phone that the denial finally shattered. She collapsed against her car, sobbing. I was placed in emergency foster care that night. The investigation exploded. Other victims of Jeff's, girls from his past, started coming forward, their own stories finally validated. During the trial, Jeff's lawyer tried to paint Thomas as the real predator, but Sarah had tracked him down. He provided all of his documentation, pages and pages of careful observations that corroborated my timeline perfectly. He also sent a letter just for me. He wrote about bravery and survival and included a recent photo of his daughters, smiling at a park, finally looking happy and safe. The jury found Jeff guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to the maximum, at least 25 years before he would even be eligible for parole. My mom entered intensive therapy. I moved in with a new foster family, just 3 blocks away from Vicky. The house where I had lived my nightmare was sold. The cameras were torn out. The past was gone. And for the first time in a very long time, I was free.